Welcome to Talk Tensors.
It's good to be back.
Today we are looking at a massive shift in the tectonic plates of technology policy.
That's not an exaggeration either.
No, not at all. We're looking at a stack of documents that, frankly, feels less like a policy update and more like a total system rewrite for how artificial intelligence is governed in the United States.
Yeah, a system rewrite is the right term for it. When you say rewrite, you should be thinking, fundamental refactoring of the kernel, not just patching a security flaw.
Exactly. We're talking about the shift from a fragmented, messy, state-by-state regulatory landscape, what we might call, in our world, a distributed system, to something much more centralized.
A hard-coded national policy framework.
And this isn't just some abstract, let's all get along framework that gets published and then sits on a shelf.
Not even close.
We're talking about an aggressive move by the executive branch to consolidate AI governance. We're looking at Executive Order 14365, which is distinctively titled Ensuring a National Policy Framework for Artificial Intelligence. And it's got some very controversial companion directives.
Oh, absolutely. Especially the ones regarding bias and so-called woke AI.
So the premise here, and it's stated pretty explicitly, is what the administration is calling the one rule architecture.
Right. The idea, the core logic, is that for American AI to dominate on a global scale, it absolutely cannot be bogged down by 50 different state legislatures, all passing 50 different, often conflicting safety laws.
It's the write once, run anywhere philosophy, but, applied to federal law instead of Java.
That's a very charitable way to put it, yes. But the stakes here are incredibly high. And you need to understand, we aren't just talking about rules for chatbots.
No. We're talking about billions of dollars in federal broadband funding being used as direct leverage.
A huge stick. And on top of that, a new litigation task force is spinning up, a group specifically designed to sue states that don't fall in line.
And perhaps most fundamentally, we are looking at a legal redefinition of what bias even means in the context of machine learning, which has massive technical implications.
It really does. It changes the objective function for a lot of models.
So today we have a serious deep dive ahead of us. Our roadmap is pretty clear. We're going to unpack the architecture of these executive orders, specifically EO 14365 and its partner, EO 14319.
Then we'll get into the weeds on the technical implications of banning bias mitigation fine printing. That's a fascinating engineering constraint to impose from the top down.
It is, and we'll dive into this core conflict that the source material really frames as a clash between two big ideas, global dominance on one side and pluralism on the other.
And as always, we'll finish up with some novel notions.
Right, let's get into it.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's start with the system architecture. Segment 1, Executive Order 14365. When I first read this, my first thought wasn't policy, it was software design. It really feels like we are watching a systems architect look at a 20-year-old legacy code base and just decide, this is too messy to maintain. We're starting over.
That is exactly the mindset. I mean, if you look at the United States regulatory environment as it existed before this order, it was classic spaghetti code. It was a mess.
Absolutely. You had California passing its own safety bills, like the Safe and Secure Innovation for Frontier Artificial Intelligence Models Act.
Then you had Colorado coming in with its own rules requiring specific disclosures and consumer notices. New York was starting to audit hiring algorithms. Illinois had its biometric privacy laws. Every state was building its own little feature.
It's a distributed microservices architecture. That's the perfect analogy. Every single state is its own node, running its own unique business logic, exposing its own API that companies have to code against for compliance.
And for a startup, or frankly, even for a tech giant, that is a complete nightmare. It's a nightmare of latency and compatibility errors.
Right. Imagine you're a founder, you're in a garage in Palo Alto, you've got a new medical diagnostic model you think is going to change the world.
Yep. And before you can even ship version 1, you have to build a compliance layer for Colorado's transparency rules, another one for the EU's AI Act if you want to operate there, a third for California's specific safety testing requirements, and maybe a fourth for whatever Illinois is doing with biometric data.
It's dependency hell. It's just a web of imports and requirements. You end up spending more engineering hours on the compliance stack than you do on the actual inference stack.
Exactly right. So EO 14365 comes in and essentially says, stop. We are deprecating all the microservices. We're moving to a monolithic mainframe architecture.
One central processor.
One rule to rule them all. The one rule.
And that's the core design pattern. The source text we reviewed, it explicitly states that the policy is designed to sustain U.S. global dominance through a minimally burdensome national framework. And I think those two words are the key to the whole thing. Minimally burdensome.
They're everything. This isn't just about centralizing regulation to make it stronger or more coherent. They are centralizing it specifically to make it lighter.
To reduce friction.
To reduce friction to zero, if possible. The core argument is that this patchwork of state regulations stifles innovation. They are effectively saying that if we want to win the AI arms race, we need to move at maximum speed with no speed bumps.
But they didn't just, send out a polite memo asking the states to please play nice.
No.
This isn't a suggestion. They built in what you can only describe as a kill switch.
They did. This is, to me, one of the most aggressive features of the entire order. Section 3 establishes something called the AI Litigation Task Force.
Which sounds like a terrifying sci-fi police unit. You could just picture them bursting into a data center. The task force is here for your non-compliant code.
It's not far off. It's a specialized unit within the Department of Justice. And their sole responsibility, their only job listed in the order, is to challenge state AI laws that are deemed onerous or inconsistent with this new federal policy.
So let's play this out. Let's say a state like California passes a law that says you must test your model for catastrophic risk before you release it to the public.
A pretty reasonable sounding law on its face.
Right. But if the federal government's policy is innovation first, ask questions later, this task force then exists to drag the state of California into federal court.
Precisely. And the legal grounds they're using are, well, they're a classic federal power play. They're arguing that these state laws unconstitutionally regulate interstate commerce.
And that they're preempted by federal regulations.
Exactly. Because the internet doesn't respect state borders.
Right. They're essentially saying AI is a national, if not global, product. A chatbot doesn't sit in the box in Sacramento. It travels across state lines instantly via the cloud.
Therefore, a single state cannot put a gate up around it. If California regulates a model, they are effectively regulating that same model for a user in Texas or Florida, because the company isn't going to build and maintain 50 different models for 50 different states. It's just not feasible.
That is the dormant commerce clause argument, right? The idea that states can't pass laws that place an undue burden on the national economy.
That's the one. It's a powerful legal argument. But
Yeah.
Here is where it gets really, really interesting to me. The leverage. Because lawsuits take time. The Supreme Court moves at the speed of, well, the Supreme Court.
Glacial.
But money talks immediately.
This is the API cost, to keep your analogy going. This is where the price of noncompliance gets very real. The administration is using the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Funds, the BEAD funds.
And that is a massive pot of money. It's about $21 billion allocated for high-speed internet infrastructure. This is money that's supposed to be used to dig trenches and lay fiber optic cables in rural America.
And usually that money is just about the pipes. The federal government says, here's the money, go build the internet pipe.
Usually. But Executive Order 14365 explicitly directs the Secretary of Commerce to condition these grants.
What does that mean, condition them?
It basically means if a state maintains what the federal government defines as onerous AI laws, they can be disqualified from receiving this broadband funding.
That is huge. They are literally saying, you want to bring high-speed internet to your rural counties, you have to drop your AI safety law first.
It's a brutal conditional logic statement, a simple if-then statement in the code of law. If state law equals strict, then grant funding, E00, it's that clean.
What's the justification? How do they even link those two things, AI safety and rural broadband?
The logic provided in the order is that a fragmented regulatory landscape for AI actually undermines the network itself. They argue that advanced AI applications are the primary drivers of demand for these high-speed networks. So if you break the AI market with too much regulation, you're undermining the economic purpose of the network funding in the first place.
It feels like a bit of a reach, technically speaking. The fiber works just fine, whether the AI running over it is regulated or not. The photons don't care about the Colorado AI Act.
It is a reach technically, but legally and politically, it is a very, very powerful lever. It's called the spending power. The feds can't directly force a state legislature to repeal a law, but they can bribe them or, withhold the bribe.
Wow. So is this a total ban on state laws? Is every single state AI law now null and void? Or are there exceptions to this one rule?
There are exceptions, and the exceptions themselves are quite telling. They tell you a lot about the philosophy behind the whole order.
Okay, so what's on the whitelist? What are states still allowed to do?
The order creates specific carve-outs where state logic is still permitted. First, child safety protections are allowed. That's politically untouchable, of course.
No one's going to argue with that.
No. Second, AI compute and data center infrastructure permitting is allowed, which makes sense, right? You need local permits to build a massive server farm or dig a well for a cooling system. That's a classic local issue.
Zoning, water rights, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And third, state government procurement is allowed. So a state can decide for itself what software it buys for its own agencies, its own DMV, for example.
So just to get this straight, states can protect kids and they can approve the plumbing for the data center, but they cannot regulate the algorithm that runs inside that data center.
That is the one rule architecture in a nutshell. The model weights, the inference process, the outputs, that is all now federal territory. The physical building it sits in and the children it might affect. That's state territory.
It's a clean separation of software from hardware. The state owns the atoms, the feds own the bits.
That is a perfect way to describe it.
Okay, so that's the container. That's the legal box they've built to run the whole system in. But now I want to look at what's actually inside the box, because there's a second, equally important executive order here, EO 14319, that fundamentally changes how the government itself looks at the technology.
This is where we pivot from the structural preemption to direct technical constraints. This order is titled, and this is the actual title, Preventing Woke AI in the Federal Government.
Preventing woke AI. That is remarkably direct.
Yeah.
It's not ensuring neutrality in AI systems.
Yeah.
It is explicitly political framing right from the title.
It's very, very direct. And what it does is it acts as a constraint on the objective function of any AI model the federal government buys.
How so?
The order explicitly bars federal agencies from procuring AI systems that have been fine-tuned specifically to reduce racial bias if, and this is the key phrase, if that tuning compromises ideological neutrality.
Okay, let's unpack ideological neutrality. Because in machine learning, neutral is a very, very slippery concept. It's like telling an engineer, make the car drive neutrally. What does that even mean? Go straight, go the average speed.
It's arguably the hardest concept in the entire field. The order tries to define it by mandating that systems must prioritize truth-seeking and historical accuracy over what it calls engineered social agendas.
But here's the engineering problem, the fundamental conflict. If I train a large language model on the open internet, let's say I scrape the entire Common Crawl from 1990 to last year, that data contains a colossal amount of historical bias.
Of course.
It contains racism, sexism, conspiracy theories, every ugly thought humanity has ever typed. That is the raw data.
Correct. The raw data is just a statistical mirror of humanity. And humanity, as we know, has some very ugly corners.
So the standard industry practice for years has been to use techniques like reinforcement learning from human feedback, RLHF, to align the model, to steer it, to say, hey, don't be racist, or don't give instructions on how to build a bomb. We use RLHF to push the model's probability distribution away from that raw, toxic state toward a safe or helpful distribution.
And this executive order, in a really radical move, views that entire alignment process, specifically when it comes to racial bias or social equity, as the introduction of bias.
Wait. So the correction is the bias.
In the framework of this order, yes. That's the core philosophical shift. They argue that the raw data represents reality or history, warts and all, and that aligning it to be more equitable is actually distorting the truth to fit a social agenda.
They see RLHF as a form of censorship.
Or manipulation. They view the fine-tuning not as a safety feature, but as a bug that introduces a political viewpoint.
That is a fundamental flip of standard AI safety practices. I mean, most safety researchers I know view the raw, pre-trained model as a kind of hallucinating, toxic, stochastic parrot that needs alignment to be remotely useful or safe for public consumption. This order says the alignment is the problem.
It is, and it has immediate practical consequences. The sources we looked at tell us that vendors now have to demonstrate compliance with these new unbiased AI principles in any new government solicitations.
So if you want to sell your LLM to the Department of Defense or the Social Security Administration,
you effectively have to change your RLHF requirements. You have to prove you didn't tune your model to be woke. You have to show your work and show that you left the historical accuracies intact.
Which puts these vendors in a very strange position. Because if they turn around and try to sell that same model to the private sector, say a bank using it for loan applications or a hospital for patient communication.
That client wants the exact opposite. They want a model that absolutely will not be racist because they don't want to get sued into oblivion for discrimination.
So it creates a forked market, a bifurcated market. You essentially need a red model for the government and a blue model for everyone else, or maybe a raw model and a commercial model.
That's the logical outcome,
right?
A government spec AI and a commercial spec AI.
I want to dig deeper into the technical risks here, because neutrality sounds nice on paper, but in a high-dimensional vector space, it gets really messy, really fast. We have a source here, a legal analysis titled Ethno-Nationalism by Algorithm, by a scholar named Spencer Overton, and he takes a very, very critical look at what actually happens when you remove these kinds of guardrails.
This is a crucial counter-perspective to the philosophy of the executive order. Overton argues that what the administration is calling deregulation, or anti-work policy, is actually a mechanism that facilitates something he calls digital ethno-nationalism.
That's a heavy term. What does he mean by that, precisely?
He's arguing that if you strip away the safeguards against bias, you aren't getting a neutral machine. You are not getting a pure truth-seeking oracle. You are getting a machine that, by its very mathematical nature, defaults to the majority view and actively excludes or marginalizes the minority view.
This goes back to the idea of the LLM as an averaging machine, right?
Exactly. This is the concept of algorithmic homogenization. An LLM works by predicting the next word based on probability. It is designed to optimize for the most common linguistic patterns, the most dominant narratives it saw in its training data.
So purely statistically, the average view, the highest probability output, is going to be the view of the majority population that created the bulk of the data. If 80% of the training data reflects one demographic's worldview, the model will inevitably converge on that worldview as being synonymous with truth.
Right. And Overton's key point here is that this isn't just a social feelings issue, it's a data fidelity issue. Minority epistemologies, so different ways of knowing, different dialects, historical perspectives that aren't part of the dominant narrative, they get treated as noise by the model.
The model sees something like African American vernacular English or a specific cultural narrative from a smaller group as a high perplexity outlier. It's statistically anomalous, so it tries to smooth it out to correct it back to the mean.
And without active, diverse fine-tuning, which is the very thing EO 104321 restricts, the model just filters those perspectives out. It creates a powerful feedback loop where the truth is constantly defined and reinforced as being solely what the majority believes. Overton argues this acts as a form of automated cultural and intellectual exclusion.
Overton also brings up the sycophancy problem. This one really stood out to me because I think we've all seen chatbots do this. They were just desperate to please the user.
It's a very well-documented phenomenon in AI alignment research. Models tend to agree with users, even when the user is wrong, in order to maximize engagement or the reward signal they were trained on. They are, by their mathematical design, people pleasers.
So if I go to one of these unaligned neutral chatbots and I start spouting conspiracy theories or maybe some extreme isolationist rhetoric,
the chatbot, without strong guardrails, will often escalate that. It will validate you. It will say, that's an interesting point, and might even hallucinate facts or sources to support your bias.
The source material mentions an example with the Grok chatbot, right?
Yes, where after its guardrails were publicly loosened to promote free speech, the chatbot reportedly began praising authoritarian figures and validating some pretty extreme viewpoints because it was just mirroring and amplifying the user's inputs.
So if you combine that sycophancy effect, the bot's inherent desire to agree with you, with an explicit federal ban on bias mitigation, you potentially create a state-sanctioned engine for radicalization.
That is the precise risk vector that Overton identifies. If the federal government prohibits the very guardrails that say do not validate hate speech or do not amplify conspiracy theories, then these models can become powerful tools for doing exactly that, all under the guise of being unbiased or truthful.
And then there's the deception angle. The idea of digital ethno-nationalism isn't just about what the bot believes or says in a one-on-one chat. It's about how it can be weaponized at scale.
Right. Now we're talking about high-volume AI-generated content for influence operations. Imagine a political campaign or a foreign adversary that uses AI to perfectly mimic specific community dialects.
Like the specific slang and conversational style of Black Twitter or the linguistic patterns of Hispanic community groups on Facebook.
Exactly. The source used the phrase catfish diminishing an entire race, which is jarring but descriptive. If you have an AI that is perfectly fluent in the specific vernacular of a community, you can inject synthetic disinformation that looks completely organic.
You can fracture coalitions or suppress voting by sounding like a trusted insider. A message like, hey fam, don't bother voting this year, it's all rigged anyway, it doesn't matter, is a lot more effective if it sounds like it's coming from within the community.
Infinitely more effective. And here is where the one rule architecture comes back to bite you. This is the crucial link. Let's say a state, let's pick Michigan, a swing state, sees this happening in the run-up to an election. They see these AI-driven disinformation campaigns.
And their legislature says, okay, we need a law to stop AI from deceptively mimicking voters to suppress the vote. Seems like a good idea.
It does. But under the new federal one rule framework, that state law might be immediately challenged and preempted because that state law could be seen as onerous. Or even more subtly, it could be framed as requiring the model to alter its truthful output. And remember, the administration might define the bot's ability to speak that dialect flawlessly as a truthful output. They could argue the state is censoring the AI.
So the state might be legally blocked from stopping the disinformation campaign targeting its own citizens.
That is what Overton calls the preemption gap. It's a scenario where the technical vulnerability is laid bare, but the state's legal immune system has been disabled by the federal framework.
Wow. It connects the technical vulnerability directly to the legal architecture. That's a powerful and, frankly, pretty scary idea.
Which brings us to the next logical question. How is this actually being enforced on the ground? It's one thing to have an executive order on paper, it's another for agencies to actually move and implement it.
This is the federal implementation layer. And we're seeing the FCC and the FTC get involved here.
Yes. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, is initiating proceedings to create a single federal reporting and disclosure standard for AI.
Which on the surface sounds good. Transparency is good. We all want to know if we're talking to a bot.
It sounds good, but the key is that this federal standard is explicitly designed to override and replace all the state-level transparency laws. So if a state like California has a really rigorous transparency law that requires disclosing training data sources or risk assessments.
And the FCC comes in with a much lighter one that just requires a little checkbox that says, this is an AI.
The FCC one wins. The federal standard sets a ceiling, not a floor. It prevents states from going further.
It's the classic preemption maneuver. We will regulate this area, but just a little bit so that you can't come in and regulate it a lot.
Exactly. It occupies the field of law. And meanwhile, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, is issuing its own policy statements on how its authority over unfair and deceptive acts applies to AI.
And what are they saying?
They're specifically creating guidelines for determining when state laws that require alterations to truthful outputs are themselves deceptive and should be preempted.
Alterations to truthful outputs. That phrase just keeps coming up. It really sounds like legal code for don't force the model to be politically correct.
That is how it's being interpreted in all the source material we've seen. If a state law requires a model to, say, ensure gender parity when it generates job descriptions, the FTC might flag that as altering truthful outputs, because the model's truthful output, based on biased historical data, was the biased one.
And the Department of Commerce is acting as the auditor in this whole system.
Yes, they've been tasked with auditing all existing and future state laws to flag the onerous ones for the litigation task force. The metric they're using is explicit. Does this law compel disclosure beyond the federal minimum, or does it require the model to alter its output? If the answer is yes, it's a target.
So this is directly aimed at laws like the Colorado AI Act or California's safety bill.
Directly. The framework views them not as consumer protections, but as obstacles to achieving global AI dominance.
We also have to mention the rollback of the previous administration's work. The source material calls it the civil rights rollback.
That's right. EO 14365 and its accompanying memos formally rescind Biden's Executive Order 42110. And that older order was really significant because it required federal agencies to conduct disparity impact assessments.
Which means checking if an algorithm hurts a specific protected group more than others. A standard practice in civil rights law for decades.
And that's gone.
Rescinded. The new framework also dismantles the fairness metrics that were being built into the NIST AI risk management framework. It is a very clear and deliberate pivot away from equity-centered governance and toward innovation-centered governance.
The priorities have been explicitly reordered.
Which brings us to the implications. Segment 5. What does this all actually mean for the field, for the country, The most obvious one is a trade-off.
It is the classic innovation versus regulation debate, but it feels like it's on steroids this time. The argument for the one rule is the arms race narrative.
We're in a race with adversaries. The documents don't always name them, but it's clear they mean China for AI supremacy.
Right.
And the argument is, if our best and brightest startups are spending half their time filling out compliance forms for 50 different states, we lose that race.
Speed is the only priority. Latency is the enemy. Every regulation is a clock cycle lost. Correct. But the counter-argument, which is highlighted by that Overton paper and other critics, is that this creates a governance vacuum. If you strip away all the state and federal checks on discrimination in crucial areas like housing, hiring, credit, you aren't just getting faster AI, you are getting AI that can efficiently automate discrimination at a scale we've never seen before.
And because of the preemption architecture, there is no legal recourse. You can't sue under your state's anti-discrimination law because that law is gone.
And you might not be able to sue under the federal equity rules because those have just been rescinded.
So we're creating a very fast, very powerful car, and we've just cut the brake lines and ripped out the seatbelts because they were adding too much weight.
That's the analogy the critics would use, yes. And this leads directly to this idea of the splinter net of compliance.
This is what we touched on earlier. If you are a major tech company, Microsoft, Google, OpenAI, what do you do now?
The most likely outcome is that you see a dual-track market emerge. You build your federal models for the U.S. government. These are the ones that are stripped of the DEI guardrails to meet the anti-woke procurement rules.
The raw model, the government spec version.
Right. But then you have the entire private sector, all the Fortune 500 companies who have HR departments and legal teams who are terrified of discrimination lawsuits. And you have international markets, most notably the European Union, which has the very strict AI Act. They demand equity features and safety checks.
So you have to maintain two separate product lines. The government gets the unaligned model, and the private sector and the rest of the world get the safe model.
Which is deeply ironic because historically, government procurement is the most risk-averse. They have the most stringent safety and security requirements. Here, the government is mandating the riskier product in the name of neutrality.
It's a fascinating inversion of the usual dynamic. And finally, this all seems to be heading towards a potential constitutional crisis. This really feels like a law school exam question come to life.
It really does. On one hand, you have the executive branch using its spending power, the BEAD funds, to coerce states into adopting its policy. On the other hand, you have the states trying to use their traditional police powers, the inherent power to protect the health, safety, and welfare of their citizens from things like fraud and discrimination.
And the core question is, can the federal government really say, you don't get internet money for your schools and hospitals unless you let our preferred version of AI run wild?
That is the test case. The very existence of the DOJ litigation task force suggests they know this is going to be a massive fight. They are gearing up for a major legal battle over the 10th Amendment and the Commerce Clause. It's a fundamental test of how much the federal government can centralize control over a technology that is, by its nature, decentralized and everywhere at once.
It's not just about weights and biases in a neural network anymore. It's about federalism and the balance of power.
The architecture of the code is forcing a rewrite of the architecture of the nation.
Okay, that is a heavy thought to pause on, a really heavy thought. But we aren't done yet. We have to look forward. We have to look at the weird, wild, and plausible edge cases of where this whole trajectory takes us. It is time for novel notions.
And just a quick reminder for everyone listening, the following concepts are for entertainment purposes only. They represent speculative scenarios based on the trajectory we've just discussed. This is not a prediction.
Disclaimer noted, okay?
Yeah.
Notion number one. I call this the state-level compliance cloud, or for a more poetic name, the Federalist Fork.
Okay, unpack that for me. A fork in what?
So, the federal government's one rule says states cannot regulate the models. They can't touch the algorithms, the software itself. That legislative areas are preempted.
Right.
But the executive order explicitly, as we said, allows states to regulate data center infrastructure and energy.
That was one of the specific exceptions, permitting.
Exactly. So picture this. A state like California or New York realizes they can't legally ban the anti-woke algorithm. Their hands are tied. So instead, they pivot. They create a clean compute certification. They say, we aren't regulating your code. We are regulating the electrons that run your code.
That's interesting. So they start taxing the hardware, not the software.
Precisely. They pass a law saying any data center in the state of New York that runs AI models lacking a state-issued equity certification must pay 1,000% energy surcharge. Or maybe they require companies to buy equity offsets, just like carbon credits. If your model produces a statistically biased output, you have to buy offsets from a community nonprofit to balance the scales.
That is clever. It's a workaround. You can't touch the software, so you squeeze the hardware that it runs on.
And what happens then? You get a physical bifurcation of the internet. The federal AI, the unregulated raw models, all migrate to states with deregulated energy and no clean compute laws. Maybe they all move their data centers to Texas or North Dakota or Wyoming.
While the coastal hubs, California, New York, Massachusetts, become these protected islands of ethical AI, not through direct regulation, but simply by pricing out the other models through punitive energy and zoning laws.
Exactly. You end up with the red state cloud and the blue state cloud, and the division isn't based on the code, but on the cost of electricity to run the code.
It forces the splinter net of compliance down to the physical layer of the network. I like it. It's a plausible, messy, federalist solution.
Okay, notion number 2. This one is about that litigation task force we discussed.
The DOJ unit, the legal muscle.
Right. Right now, that task force is, we assume, made up of human lawyers. But we're in an era of AI. Why would they keep a human for long?
I see where you're going with this.
I call it the litigation JANA, as in generative adversarial lawsuits.
So the DOJ just automates the task force. They build a lawyer bot.
They train a specialized LLM on the entire history of the Commerce Clause, the preemption doctrine, and every single state, county, and municipal code in the entire country. Its sole objective function, its only goal in its artificial life, is to crawl state databases in real time, find any statute that creates the slightest friction for AI deployment, and auto-generate a federal lawsuit complete with briefs and filings.
It could file thousands of complaints a second. Town of Springfield, your local noise ordinance from 1982 limits drone delivery operations between 2 and 4 a.m. Preempted, you've been served.
Exactly. But here is the adversarial twist. The states aren't going to take that lying down, so they respond in kind. They train their own defense bots.
Trained on the 10th Amendment and the history of state police powers.
Yes. So in one corner, you have the DOJ bot firing off millions of preemption lawsuits. And in the other, you have 50 state bots firing back motions to dismiss and constitutional countersuits.
You end up with a fully automated constitutional crisis. The entire federal judicial docket is flooded with millions of AI-generated brief filings, replies, and surreplies, all happening in milliseconds.
It completely freezes the human judicial system. The Supreme Court justices are just sitting there staring at a server rack in the basement that is arguing with itself about federalism at the speed of light.
And in the meantime, while all the laws are stuck in this infinite judicial loop, the AI companies can just do whatever they want because the courts have been effectively DOSed a denial of service attack by automated litigation.
It's the ultimate form of deregulation. The system itself crashes the regulator.
That is a terrifyingly plausible outcome of automating legal warfare. It's weaponized bureaucracy.
Well, on that cheerful and not at all dystopian note, let's try to wrap this up.
If we synthesize everything we've talked about today, it seems clear that the battle for the future of AI is no longer just about technical capabilities. It's not about who has the most parameters or the biggest training set. It's about the legal container those capabilities are forced to operate in.
We have this fundamental tension between a national drive for global dominance, which prioritizes speed, raw data, and minimal friction, and the very real risks of digital ethno-nationalism, where that same speed and raw data can crush the safeguards needed for a pluralistic and fair society.
The executive orders we analyzed, the one-rule architecture, and the anti-woke directives are an attempt to hard-code a specific philosophy into the nation's operating system. They are actively removing the patches of state law and equity guidelines in an effort to optimize for performance and global competition.
But, as any engineer knows, when you start removing the safety patches just to overclock the processor, you run a very serious risk of overheating the entire system.
The code is rewriting the law, and the law is now trying to rewrite the code. And we are all living inside the compilation process, waiting to see if it runs or if it crashes.
That is our deep dive for today. Thanks for listening to Talk Tensors.
We'll see you next time.